not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me. And as my obsession grew, I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
Imagine the boy next door, a shy, unassuming young man with a polite demeanor and a quiet smile. But beneath that mask lies an unimaginable darkness. Jeffrey Dahmer, a name that sends chills down spines, wasn't just a murderer, he was a monster hiding in plain sight. His story isn't just about the horrors he committed, but the chilling reality that someone so ordinary could harbor such extraordinary evil. From childhood curiosities to unspeakable atrocities, this is the haunting tale of the man the world came to know as the Milwaukee Cannibal.
Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, into what seemed like a typical middle-class family. His father, Lionel, was a diligent chemist, and his mother, Joyce, struggled with anxiety and hypochondria, often seeking attention through exaggerated illnesses. As a toddler, Jeffrey was cheerful and curious, loved by his parents, but cracks in the family dynamic began to form. Joyce's struggles with mental health led to frequent arguments with Lionel, creating a volatile atmosphere that left Jeffrey yearning for stability. When Jeffrey was 4 years old, an incident involving animal bones marked a turning point in his psyche. While Lionel was cleaning out animal remains from beneath their house, Jeffrey became fixated on the clinking sound of the bones, a fascination that would grow darker over time. Despite his early charm, Jeffrey grew increasingly quiet and withdrawn, particularly after undergoing surgery for a double hernia at age 6. His parents noticed a change in him. The once energetic child became subdued and introspective, a shadow of his former self. By the time Jeffrey entered elementary school, he displayed a deep discomfort with change and a preference for solitude. His classmates considered him shy but harmless, unaware of the dark thoughts that simmered beneath his quiet exterior. Lionel and Joyce's troubled marriage only exacerbated Jeffrey's isolation. Their frequent arguments, coupled with Joyce's retreat into her bedroom for days at a time, left Jeffrey to fend for himself emotionally, developing an early sense of abandonment. As a teenager, Jeffrey's odd interests became more apparent. He started collecting roadkill, dissecting the animals in his backyard, and preserving their bones. Lionel, initially believing this was scientific curiosity, even showed him how to clean and bleach bones. Jeffrey's relationship with his peers deteriorated as his peculiar behavior became more noticeable. While his classmates laughed at his bizarre pranks, like pretending to have epileptic seizures, they kept their distance, sensing something unsettling about him. When Jeffrey discovered his attraction to men during adolescence, he felt ashamed and confused. Unable to confide in anyone, he turned to alcohol, carrying bottles of hard liquor in his school jacket to numb his pain and suppress his thoughts. By his late teens, Jeffrey was utterly consumed by loneliness and dark fantasies. His parents' divorce in 1978 left him alone in the family home, abandoned by both his mother, who took his younger brother, and his father, who remarried and moved away. Left unchecked, Jeffrey's fantasies evolved into something far more sinister. He imagined having total control over another person, someone who would never leave him, a companion he could possess entirely. This need for dominance would later define his crimes. Though Lionel tried to guide Jeffrey toward a normal life, such as enrolling him at Ohio State University, Jeffrey's alcoholism and lack of direction led to failure. He dropped out after one semester, returning home to a life of isolation and aimlessness. Lionel's frustration with Jeffrey's drinking and lack of purpose led him to push his son into joining the military. Jeffrey complied, but his destructive habits followed him, and he was discharged after 2 years due to excessive alcohol abuse. With nowhere else to turn, Jeffrey moved in with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. Although she provided some structure, his dark thoughts only deepened as he continued to drink and withdraw from the world. These formative years laid the foundation for Jeffrey Dahmer's descent into the horrors he would later commit. His isolation, coupled with his obsession with control and death, marked the beginning of a path that would shock the world. In June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer crossed the line from dark fantasy into brutal reality. While driving near his Ohio home, he encountered Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker heading to a rock concert. Dahmer offered Hicks a ride, enticing him with promises of cold beer and good company at his empty family home. Hicks, young and trusting, accepted, unaware of the fate that awaited him. At the house, the two drank beer and listened to music, engaging in casual conversation. For a brief moment, it seemed like an ordinary encounter between two strangers. But Jeffrey had no intention of letting Stephen leave. As the evening wore on, Hicks mentioned that it was time for him to go. This triggered something in Jeffrey, a fear of abandonment that had plagued him throughout his life. He decided he couldn't let Hicks leave, no matter the cost. When Hicks stood to leave, Jeffrey struck him from behind with a 10-pound dumbbell, knocking him unconscious. He then strangled Hicks to death with the bar of the dumbbell, his first act of murder driven by desperation and an overwhelming need for control. After the act, Jeffrey sat with Hicks' lifeless body, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. There was fear of being caught, but also a sense of satisfaction he finally had someone who couldn't leave him. The next morning, Jeffrey faced the grim task of disposing of the body. He dragged Hicks' corpse to the basement, where he dismembered it, working methodically as though he were performing a grotesque experiment. He packed the remains into garbage bags and buried them in the woods behind his house. Weeks later, fearing discovery, he unearthed the remains, dissolved the flesh in acid, and crushed the bones with a sledgehammer before scattering them. Despite the gruesome nature of the crime, Jeffrey felt no remorse. Instead, he was relieved he had successfully covered his tracks. This marked the beginning of a pattern he would refine with each subsequent victim. Hicks' murder was not premeditated, but it revealed Jeffrey's capacity for violence and his ability to conceal it. He realized that fulfilling his dark fantasies was not only possible but intoxicating. Afterward, Jeffrey tried to return to normal life, pretending nothing had happened. But the memory of Hicks' murder lingered in his mind, both haunting and exciting him, pushing him closer to committing more heinous acts. In the years that followed, Jeffrey's life spiraled further out of control. His drinking intensified, and his attempts to lead a conventional life failed miserably. The murder of Stephen Hicks had opened a door that Jeffrey could never close. Though he didn't kill again for several years, the seed had been planted. The experience of taking a life gave Jeffrey a sense of power and satisfaction he had never felt before, fueling his descent into darkness. The first kill, as horrifying as it was only the beginning. It was the point of no return for Jeffrey Dahmer, setting him on a path that would lead to unimaginable horrors and the deaths of 16 more men. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't kill again for nearly a decade, but his fantasies never stopped. He moved to Milwaukee, where he lived with his grandmother, trying to suppress his urges. Yet, the darkness within him only grew stronger. By 1987, Jeffrey could no longer resist. While at a local gay bar, he met Stephen Twomey, a 25-year-old man who agreed to spend the night with him at a hotel. Jeffrey had no intention of killing him but lost control during the night. The next morning, Jeffrey awoke to find Twomey's lifeless body beside him, his chest crushed. Though he claimed not to remember the act, Jeffrey didn't hesitate to dismember the body and dispose of it in garbage bags. Each victim was drugged, strangled, and dismembered. Jeffrey kept trophies, skulls, bones, and even genitalia, preserving them as mementos of his crimes. He later confessed that these objects helped him feel closer to his victims. From then on, Jeffrey's killings became more frequent and methodical. He lured victims with promises of money, companionship, or photographs, often targeting young men of color who lived on the fringes of society. This second murder marked a turning point for Jeffrey. Unlike his first victim, Stephen Twomey's death wasn't an accident, it was the result of Jeffrey's growing inability to control his violent urges. Jeffrey's methods became more grotesque as his fantasies evolved. He experimented with preserving entire skeletons and attempted to create zombies by drilling holes into his victims' skulls and injecting acid or boiling water. The murders provided Jeffrey with a sense of control and intimacy he craved but could never achieve in life. He described his victims as objects, tools for fulfilling his dark desires without fear of rejection or abandonment. By the time of his arrest in 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had murdered 17 young men, each crime more horrific than the last. His descent into depravity was fueled by a combination of loneliness, rejection, and an insatiable need for dominance. The apartment where Jeffrey lived became a house of horrors. Police would later find human remains stored in his refrigerator and freezer, along with Polaroids documenting his gruesome acts in graphic detail. Despite the escalating violence, Jeffrey maintained a facade of normalcy. He held down a job and interacted politely with neighbors, who never suspected the atrocities happening just beyond the walls of his apartment. Jeffrey's insatiable appetite for control, combined with his meticulous planning, allowed him to evade capture for years. But his growing carelessness and arrogance would ultimately lead to his downfall. The horrific nature of his crimes shocked the world, leaving a legacy of grief and unanswered questions for the families of his victims. Jeffrey Dahmer's story is one of unimaginable horror, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface. Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror came to an end on July 22, 1991, when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape his apartment and flagged down police. Edwards led officers to Dahmer's residence, where they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The stench of death permeated the air as investigators uncovered photographic evidence of dismembered bodies, along with human remains stored in Dahmer's refrigerator and freezer. What began as a routine inquiry quickly unraveled into one of the most gruesome crime investigations in American history. During his arrest, Dahmer remained eerily calm, even cooperative, as he detailed his heinous acts. He confessed to killing 17 young men between 1978 and 1991, sharing every sickening detail with investigators. He explained his methods, his motivations, and his morbid fascination with preserving parts of his victims. His cold, matter-of-fact demeanor during these confessions left even seasoned detectives shaken. As news of his crimes spread, public outrage erupted. Families of the victims demanded justice, and Dahmer's name became synonymous with evil. His trial, which began in January 1992, captivated the world. In the courtroom, Dahmer showed little emotion as prosecutors presented the horrific evidence against him, including Polaroids of his victims and testimonies from forensic experts who detailed his grotesque acts of violence. Dahmer's defense did not deny his guilt but instead argued that he was legally insane, pointing to his necrophilic tendencies and cannibalistic acts as proof. However, the prosecution countered that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions and had meticulously planned his crimes, demonstrating that he knew right from wrong. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury rejected the insanity plea and found Dahmer guilty on 15 counts of murder. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the victims' families, but the trial also left a haunting question in the minds of many. How could such atrocities go unnoticed for so long? Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, totaling 957 years. He would serve his time at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he was placed in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes. In prison, Dahmer's demeanor changed. He expressed remorse for his actions, admitting to the gravity of his crimes in interviews with reporters. He even requested a Bible, claiming to have found religion and seeking forgiveness for his sins. Despite his apparent transformation, many viewed his attempts at redemption with skepticism, believing them to be an extension of his manipulative tendencies. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer's life came to a violent end. While performing his assigned work detail in the prison gymnasium, he and 2 other inmates were left unsupervised. One of those inmates, Christopher Scarver, attacked Dahmer with a metal bar, beating him to death. Scarver later claimed that he was disturbed by the nature of Dahmer's crimes and believed he was carrying out divine justice. Dahmer's death sparked mixed reactions. For the families of his victims, it brought an abrupt end to their long quest for justice, but it also denied them the opportunity to see him live out his sentence. For some, his death was a fitting end for a man who had inflicted so much pain and suffering. For others, it was a reminder of the cycle of violence that his crimes had perpetuated. Jeffrey Dahmer's legacy remains one of infamy. His crimes shocked the world, exposing the darkest corners of human nature and the failures of the systems meant to protect society. His death, like his life, left more questions than answers, ensuring that his story would be remembered as one of the most chilling chapters in criminal history.
All right, so today we're going to be unpacking one of the most infamous cases in criminal history.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Dahmer. And we're going to, attempt to understand how someone can go from an outwardly ordinary life, to committing these really horrific acts.
Yeah.
And you were kind enough to share Dahmer's biography with me.
Yes.
And, I really think I'm interested to do this deep dive with you because I'm so fascinated by this whole nature versus nurture thing. Were there any early signs? Was there anything that could have potentially been different?
Right.
In his life?
It's a question that's puzzled a lot of experts for decades.
Yeah.
And as we get into it, you'll see that it's really anything but straightforward.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning.
Okay.
With his childhood. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee to a seemingly stable middle-class family.
Yeah.
Not exactly the typical background that we would expect to see with a serial killer, right?
Exactly. And that's what makes it so compelling because it really does challenge some of our assumptions about serial killers coming from, broken homes or whatever.
Right.
On the surface, his early life seemed pretty typical.
Right.
Father was a chemist. His mother was a homemaker.
Yeah, but I'm guessing that things weren't as idyllic as they seemed.
Exactly. There were some underlying tensions.
Okay.
His mother, Joyce, she struggled with mental health issues.
Okay.
And that led to a lot of conflict between the parents.
Yeah.
And young Jeffrey really craved stability. But that wasn't really the reality at home.
Right. And then there's that incident when he was just 4 years old.
Yeah.
His father was, cleaning out animal remains.
Right.
And Dahmer was just completely fixated on the sound of those bones.
Yeah.
In retrospect, it seems like such a significant detail.
Yeah. Well, it could be, kind of dismissed as just childhood curiosity.
Yeah.
Knowing what we know now about his future, it's hard not to see it as a possible early indicator of a fascination with death, even in animals.
Right. It's like that first crack in the foundation or something.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then at age 6, he had surgery for a double hernia.
Yeah.
And his personality just seemed to shift.
Yeah.
He became much more withdrawn and quiet. Do you think that was a direct result of the surgery or?
Well, it's really hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
And that's one of the challenges of, looking back at these early events and trying to analyze them.
Right.
Is this really a turning point or just a coincidence?
Yeah.
And it's a question that we'll kind of continue to explore as we go deeper.
Okay. So as he got older, he became increasingly isolated in school.
Yeah.
And, there were some behavioral red flags like faking seizures to get attention.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us can probably relate to wanting to fit in. But, his way of going about it was very unusual.
Right. And then that fascination with death continued. He started collecting roadkill.
Oh, wow.
Dissecting animals.
Yeah.
Disturbing behavior.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah.
But at this point, it's not criminal.
Right. And that brings up such an important point, though.
Yeah.
How do we distinguish between what might just be odd or weird behavior and something that's truly dangerous, especially in, teenagers?
So one of the toughest challenges, I think, in this field.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating about this is that his father, Lionel, actually showed him how to clean and bleach animal bones
Wow.
thinking it was just scientific curiosity.
Gee. In hindsight, that's a pretty chilling detail.
It's like looking back at an old photograph and
Yeah.
noticing something unsettling that you totally missed the first time.
Yeah. Yeah. So during this time, he was also really struggling with his sexual identity. He, realized he was attracted to men.
Right?
And, you can imagine in the social climate of that era.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we really have to keep in mind that societal context, homosexuality was still heavily stigmatized.
Right.
It's very likely he felt, incredibly isolated and unable to confide in anyone about his feelings.
Yeah. Instead of seeking support, he turned to alcohol, which is, a common but obviously unhealthy coping mechanism.
It is.
And then to make matters worse, his parents divorced when he was 18.
Right.
His mother took his younger brother and moved away.
Yeah.
His father remarried and also moved away.
Yeah.
That left Dahmer all alone in the family home.
Yeah. It's like a perfect storm of circumstances
Yeah.
all converging at this really pivotal moment in his development.
Yeah.
And he's dealing with a lot, questions of identity, internalized shame, and now this very profound sense of abandonment.
Yeah, it just paints a picture of a young man struggling to cope with a lot of intense emotions. And tragically, this seems like it was a major turning point for Dahmer, pushing him down this really dark path.
Yeah, because not long after this is when Jeffrey Dahmer commits his first murder. It was June of 1978, just a few weeks after graduating high school. Dahmer was driving around Ohio when he picked up Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker.
So Hicks was just, trying to get to a concert, and Dahmer offers him a ride.
Right.
Completely unaware of the danger he's in.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just terrifying to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
Dahmer brings him back to his family's home, empty at this point.
Right.
With the promise of beer and some company. They spend some time together listening to music.
It's almost unsettling how normal that sounds,
Yes.
which makes what happened next even more jarring.
And this is where that fear of abandonment, I think, really comes into play.
Okay.
As the evening goes on, Hicks mentions he needs to leave, and Dahmer just panics at the thought of being alone.
So was this first murder premeditated?
It doesn't seem so. It seems more like a very desperate act,
Okay.
driven by this impulse to kind of control the situation.
Yeah.
As Hicks is leaving, Dahmer strikes him from behind with a dumbbell
Wow.
and then strangles him.
That's just chilling to think about that sudden escalation of violence.
It is, and what's really striking is Dahmer's reaction afterward.
Okay.
There was no remorse.
Wow.
Only this sense of satisfaction
Really?
at having achieved this twisted sense of control. He had someone now who couldn't leave
Right.
in the most horrific way imaginable.
So then what did he do with the body?
He takes Hicks's body down to the basement and dismembers it
Okay.
very methodically, almost like a gruesome scientific experiment.
Right.
He buries the remains in the woods behind the house.
And then I think a few weeks later, he dug up the remains because he was worried about them being discovered, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
He dissolves the flesh in acid,
Jeez.
crush the bones. The level of calculation is fascinating and terrifying.
Yeah. Did he try to get help after this or talk to anybody about what he had done?
No, he buries this secret
Wow.
and tries to move on with his life. But that first kill, it seems like it was really a point of no return.
Yeah.
He had crossed this line.
Yeah.
And the darkness within him just continued to grow.
It's like that act opened a door that he could never close again.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
It unlocked something within him.
Yeah.
He had tasted that feeling of power and control
Right.
in this really twisted way. And it set the stage for what was to come.
Because he didn't kill again for almost a decade.
Right. Almost a decade.
So what happened to trigger that escalation?
So he moves to Milwaukee and tries to suppress these urges.
Okay.
But in 1987, he meets a man named Stephen Twomey at a gay bar.
Okay.
They go back to a hotel room together. Dahmer claims that he blacked out and woke up to find Twomey dead.
Okay. But he still dismembered the body. I mean, that
Yeah.
seems like a pretty significant detail to just gloss over.
It is. And I think it's very possible there's more to that story
Right,
than
yeah.
he's letting on. But even if this second murder was not fully intentional,
Right.
it solidified a pattern.
Okay.
That act of dismemberment suggests a certain level of premeditation and a desire to cover up his actions.
It's like that first kill broke down some kind of barrier.
Right.
And now the second one is really reinforcing the path that he's on.
Exactly. From that point on, the killings escalate. They
Okay.
become more frequent, more planned.
He starts developing a modus operandi.
Yes, he would lure his victims back to his apartment with promises of money or companionship. He often preyed on young men of color,
Right.
who were marginalized individuals he felt would be less likely to be missed.
Yeah, and the brutality of the crimes intensified.
Yes.
He was drugging his victims, strangling them,
Mm-hmm.
dismembering the bodies. He even started keeping trophies,
Yeah.
skulls bones.
Yeah.
What's the psychological significance behind that?
The trophies speak to, I think, this deep need for control,
Okay.
for possession.
Mm-hmm.
He claimed that they made him feel closer to his victims,
Wow.
which is such a chilling insight into his psyche.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough to just take their lives.
Right.
He wanted to keep a part of them with him.
And he even experimented with trying to create zombies
Mm-hmm.
by drilling holes into their skulls and injecting acid.
It's just a level of depravity that's hard to even fathom.
Yeah, and the scariest part is that he was living this totally double life.
Right.
He had a job, he interacted with neighbors,
Yeah.
maintained this facade of normalcy. No one suspected the horrors that he was committing.
And that ability to compartmentalize is actually a key characteristic of psychopathic individuals.
Okay.
They often lack empathy and remorse.
Right.
They're very skilled at manipulating others.
Yeah.
It makes their crimes even more difficult to detect
Yeah.
because they can blend in so seamlessly.
But eventually his facade started to crumble. So how did it all finally end for Dahmer?
It all started to unravel in July of 1991
Okay.
when one of his intended victims, a 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards,
Right.
managed to escape.
This is the story I think I remember most vividly because it's the one that finally exposed everything.
Right.
Edwards was actually able to flag down 2 police officers while he was still wearing handcuffs.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story of survival.
Can you imagine?
I know.
Yeah.
He tells this really harrowing tale to the police about being drugged and held captive by Dahmer.
Yeah, I can only imagine how unbelievable that must have sounded at first.
Absolutely. It sounds like something out of a horror movie.
Yeah.
But Edwards insists on taking the police back to Dahmer's apartment to prove that he's telling the truth.
And that's when everything comes to light.
Exactly. At first, Dahmer is very calm and cooperative.
Okay.
He lets the officers inside. But as they start looking around, they notice some strange smells.
Right.
And then they find the Polaroids.
Those Polaroids of Dahmer's victims in various stages of dismemberment are some of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in this case.
They're absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
And they left no doubt about the horrors that had been taking place in that apartment.
It's hard to believe that someone could document their crimes in such a calculated way.
I know.
So what was Dahmer's reaction when the police found those pictures?
He confessed to everything.
Really?
And he did so with this really chilling detachment,
Wow.
showing no remorse whatsoever.
So he was almost proud of what he had done?
It's possible. He might have even seen himself as a kind of artist,
Yeah.
creating these grotesque tableaus.
Right.
There's a level of narcissism there that's really hard to grasp.
And then, of course, the police uncover the full extent of his crimes.
Yes.
Human remains in his refrigerator freezer, a vat of acid,
Yes.
skulls, bones, body parts all throughout the apartment.
It was a scene that shocked even the most seasoned investigators.
Yeah.
The apartment was just this testament to his depravity, a literal house of horrors.
Yeah, his trial was a media sensation,
Of course.
understandably. And he was found guilty of 15 counts of murder
Right.
and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms.
Yeah.
He was later killed in prison in 1994.
That's right. Beaten to death by a fellow inmate.
So as we come to the end of this deep dive,
Yeah.
I think the biggest question that lingers is what can we learn
Right.
from this dark chapter in human history?
I think Dahmer's case serves as this chilling reminder that evil can really hide in plain sight. It challenges us to question our assumptions
Yeah.
about who's capable of violence.
Right.
And it highlights, I think, the importance of understanding those early warning signs, even if they seem small or insignificant.
For me, one of the most impactful takeaways is just how much societal factors played a role in Dahmer's life.
Absolutely.
The homophobia of that era, his isolation, the lack of support.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard not to wonder if things could have been different. If he'd had a safe space to kind of explore his feelings and struggles.
I think that's such a crucial point.
Yeah.
We need to create a more inclusive and supportive society
Yeah.
that offers people alternatives to the darkness.
Right.
A society where people feel comfortable seeking help when they need it.
Because ignoring these issues, as we've seen, can have really devastating consequences.
Dahmer's story is a tragedy on so many levels for the victims and their families, for the community that was terrorized by him,
Right.
and for a society that just failed to recognize and address those warning signs.
It's a story that really stays with you.
Yeah.
It forces you to confront some really uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world that we live in. We've covered a lot of complex information today.
We have.
But it leaves me with one final haunting question for our listeners.
Okay.
Could tragedies like this be prevented? And if so, how?
That's a question I think we all need to grapple with, both individually and as a society.
Yeah.
And I think by learning from the past and working to create a more just and compassionate world, we can hopefully prevent future tragedies.
Well, thank you for joining us for this difficult but very important deep dive into the life and crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. We hope this episode has encouraged you to think critically about these issues and to consider how we can all work towards a world where such horrors are less likely to occur.